unique and so special.
Yeah. And one of the things that I think other people admire about you, and we've, you mentioned it briefly before, is the Challenged Athletes Foundation and making sure that it's accessible to everybody, and
Yeah.
that not just accessible to age groupers, but accessible to everybody. And concurrent to your rise in the sport media world, you did, you know, start co-founded this Challenged Athletes Foundation,
Mhm.
and most people will form a foundation based on personal reasons for doing so. Can you tell the listener a little bit about why you and your co-founders started the CAF over 30 years
Yeah,
ago?
absolutely. Back in 1985, there was a guy named Jim McLaren who was an offensive lineman at Yale, 300-pound offensive lineman. And he was taking acting classes in New York City, was on his motorcycle going to acting class, got hit by a New York City bus, thrown 90 feet in the air, did an arrival, lived, ended up losing his lower left leg, got a prosthetic. And with a walking leg, he went to a marathon and ran 3:16 with a
Wow.
walking leg, right? And we're not talking the high tech prosthetics you see today. We're talking about one step up from Captain Hook. Then he comes to Kona, which is where I met him, and he goes 10:42. We're talking top 20% of everybody in the race. Everybody knows who he is. He's sponsored by Budweiser. He's traveling the world. In 93, he's racing Orange County Performing Arts Center Triathlon in Mission Viejo. A van goes through a closed intersection, hits the back of his bike, propels him headfirst in a pole, and becomes a quadriplegic. And at that point, two close friends of mine, Jeffrey Essica was actually the CFO at the Tinley Company, which was a clothing company, and Rick Kozlowski was a fellow 1980 Ironman guy who I met back then, and he put on all the major races in San Diego triathlon. So the three of us got together, and the goal was because I had a background with challenge athletes. I covered a lot of wheelchair athletes, five-time Boston Marathon champion Jim Kanab, and he won the LA Marathon 3 times, and he taught me so much about disability. I remember interviewing Jimmy at his house. He was an Olympic trials pole vaulter who also had a motorcycle accident before he was which paralyzed him. And I remember interviewing Jimmy he was going to be on the cover of Competitor, and no magazine was putting wheelchair guys on the cover of a magazine, but the stories to me were so rich, and they really made a difference. Here's a guy, if what he's doing is inspiring other people to say, well, my back's a little sore, but this guy's out there in a wheelchair pushing himself. What's my excuse? So I'm in Jimmy's house. This is Jim Kanab. And I'm interviewing the guy, and I look down, and there's a nickel on the floor. And my first thought is, the poor guy, he can't reach down and pick up the nickel. So I go to pick up the nickel, and it's glued to the floor. And I look up, and Jimmy's drinking a beer, and he's like, "So Babbitt, you didn't think the poor cripple guy could pick up a nickel off the floor? Here's lesson number one: don't ever underestimate anyone." And I just learned so many lessons from that guy. His whole thing, which resonated for somebody in a wheelchair or on a race bike, he would say, "Hey, the person who wins a race isn't the one who goes the fastest, the one who slows down the least." That's something anybody can relate to. Or he'd go to rehab centers, and he'd be like, "Listen, they're telling you what you can't do. I'm here to tell you what you can do." And that was Jimmy. And so
Right.
when Jim McLaren was injured the second time, it became a quad. It was obvious that we needed to do something. So the goal was we're going to put on a little triathlon. We're going to raise 25 grand, and we're going to buy Jimmy a van with hand controls to give him independence. That was it. Because one of the things I learned from talking to wheelchair athletes, I asked them the worst part about their new lot in life. Invariably, it was, "I'm 30 years old. Here come mom and dad back in my life. I was an independent person. Now I'm not."
Right.
So how do we give Jimmy independence? Van with hand control. That was it. We raised 49, figure our job's done, and then 3 amputee women who put a team together to support Jimmy at this triathlon came up to us and said, "Hey, it's great we did for Jimmy, but did you know when you get injured, your health insurance will cover a walking around leg or a everyday wheelchair. Nothing to do with sport is covered by insurance." Well, that didn't make sense to us. So we got our 501c3 and decided if someone needed a piece of equipment for training, or a piece of equipment, training, or travel expenses, that we'd be there. Now it's been 31 years. We've raised $180 million. sent out over 48,000 grants to challenge athletes in all 50 states, in 73 countries, and more importantly, and for equipment, training, travel in 105 different sports. And our 105th sport was wheelchair pickleball last year. So it's, and all that ties together. I mean, Jimmy was a triathlete. I always called triathlon a small sport with a huge heart. That's where we started. Now we put on every year we put on $1 million challenge bike ride down the coast, San Francisco to San Diego, 175 riders. In 2023, we raised 3.3 or so million dollars from that ride. We do a gala in New York, a gala in San Francisco.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's pretty special, and our athletes are special. It's great. Just you give somebody a piece of equipment, they change the world.
Yeah, well, and change the world. They also are able to excel. I know that your foundation has also given at least some funding, maybe along the way, to 50% of the athletes who made up Team USA at the Paralympics this year. Is that correct?
There was 225 members of Team USA in Paris, and 127 of those had received grants from CAF.
Yeah.
And that's not including Lauren Parker and a number of our international athletes. That's the key. And having a mom come up, this was in Rio, this woman, Deborah Jackson, came up to me in the hotel lobby, and she goes, Desmond, her son, who's an amputee, says, you guys got him a running leg 3 years ago. Tonight he's running in the finals in the 200 meters.
Yeah.
That's the type of stuff. It's you can change lives for the better with a piece of equipment. That to me is a no-brainer. And then the next thing is, actually next week, I go to the Major League Baseball Network up in beautiful Secaucus, New Jersey, and taking Parker Bird, who 2 years ago last February became the first baseball player with a prosthetic leg to play Division I baseball. And by getting on Sports Center and getting on World News Tonight, all these families with their kids who are amputees, who were connected to Parker because of baseball, have reached out to him. And Parker is constantly connecting me with these families. And so Parker is coming to Secaucus along with this young man, J.J. Reeder, who lost his leg to a shark attack 3 years ago. He's 13 years old. And both those guys will be with us in studio. Just the power of baseball, the power of sport, the power of connection. There's so much there that we love seeing.
Mm-hmm. And you said that, you have these galas and races and things like that. Is that the main way of funding the foundation, or are you now more with sponsorships? How could a everyday listener get involved and help with the fundraising?
Yeah, fundraise your way is what a lot of people do. Is we'll help them create a website, and they're training for Ironman Wisconsin. They could fundraise by training for Ironman Wisconsin and by racing Ironman Wisconsin. So we have a lot of people who fundraise your way. We have the gala in San Francisco, gala in New York. We have our San Diego Triathlon Challenge, which is the event that we created for Jim McLaren. And then we also have Nike is a long-time global partner of ours, Toyota, EOS, which owns over 100 fitness centers around the country. And what's great about EOS, any challenged athlete and their family gets a free membership to go to EOS and work out. And one of the things when we're reading, actually, and starts in January, we start reading through the grant requests for 2025. And you read through the grant requests and you see people with disabilities and what they make, financially, and you're seeing $25,000. So when someone like that is asking for a wheelchair basketball chair that's $4,500, it's not like that's even feasible for them to afford. Right? You're making $30,000, and you need a $5,000 piece of equipment, or you need travel to go to the baseball World Series. Those type of things. It's invaluable. The grants we provide, and that's my favorite thing is reading through these grants, because you're going, the guy's he's at a stop sign and a billboard falls on his car, paralyzed from the waist down. I mean, how people get injured is a lot of it is fluky, a lot of it's congenital, but it's the one thing that connects the dots to me is the power of sport to change lives for the better, because you get out there and you know what it feels like. You ride your bike, you feel better. You go to the gym, you feel better. You avoid the opioids. You avoid all the, you avoid the dad is at home because he's paralyzed and doesn't own a hand cycle, and the family goes for a bike ride without him.
Right.
Or dad has a hand cycle and goes on the bike ride with him. Huge difference in the family dynamics. So that to me is what all this is about. Actually, one year at our San Diego Triathlon Challenge, something that really resonated with me, a mom came up and she goes, "You guys don't realize that for my son in a small town in Michigan, for 363 days a year, he feels like a freak. He's the only amputee in the city. He's the only amputee that we know, and people stare every time he walks out of the house. He comes here, and there's 150 challenged athletes, and there's prosthetic legs laying all over the place, and there's wheelchairs and all the rest of it. He feels like everybody else. He feels normal. Normalcy is something that, I tell people this all the time. When every time a athlete like Rudy Garcia Tolson, who's a double above knee amputee, and we've been working with these 7, every time he walks out of the house, the spotlight's on. You don't blend when you're an amputee, or if you're in a wheelchair. People stare. You either embrace it or you shrink from it. And the majority of our kids, they embrace it. That leg is what makes them different in a good way.
Mm.